Hello, and thank you for watching. I'm Susan Cheka-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL is the 501c3 charity that raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. Learn more at ffrpl.org. We are delighted to present this installment of the virtual version of our Fall 2020 Book Sandwiched In series of book reviews. As many of you know, Book Sandwiched In has been running continuously since 1956. We'd like to thank all of our reviewers who are participating remotely this season, and we look forward to welcoming everyone back to the library when it is safe and healthy for staff, reviewers, and the public. Our fall BSI roster focuses on diversity and inclusion. Today's presentation will be a review of The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., written by Peniel E. Joseph and described by anti-racist author Ibram X. Kendi as a landmark book. Our presenter is Reverend Dr. Angela D. Sims. Sims is the first female president of Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School and the first president to lead CRCDS at its new location on North Goodman Street. Prior to joining CRCDS in July of 2019, she was affiliated with the St. Paul School of Theology, where she served as the vice president of institutional advancement, the Robert B. and Kathleen Rogers Professor in Church and Society, and as a professor of ethics and Black church studies. She holds a PhD in Christian social ethics from Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Prior to matriculation at Union, she completed a baccalaureate degree summa cum laude at Trinity College, renamed Trinity Washington University, and she has a Master's of Divinity with honors at Howard University School of Divinity. The Reverend Dr. Sims has cast a vision for CRCDS to become a seminary of and for the community, committed to practices of peace, service, and justice. A renowned womanist scholar, her research examines connections between faith, race, and violence. She is the author and co-author of several books and is the recipient of an array of grants and fellowships. Prior to pursuing her theological work, she served in the business field, where she acquired skills that have proven essential in her administrative work.
Peniel E. Joseph's The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., informed by social historical analysis, provides a nuanced account of two iconic public figures and their evolving positions about and response to white supremacy in the United States. This book, informed by archival research and contributions of authors and scholars such as Taylor Branch, David J. Garrow, Alex Haley, Manning Marable, Stephen B. Oates, Patrick Parr, and William W. Sells Jr., is a biographical masterpiece that challenges readers to think deeply about human agency and whose lives matter. With the skill of an accomplished narrator, Joseph presents a detailed portrayal of two men who came of political age at the dawn of the Cold War in a racially charged climate eerily similar to the second decade of the 21st century. Framed by an introduction, Beyond Dreams and Nightmares, and an epilogue, The Legacy of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., Joseph's 10 chapters, The Radical Dignity of Malcolm X, The Radical Citizenship of Martin Luther King, The World Stage, A World on Fire, Birmingham's Radicals. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. What is a dream to you is a nightmare to us. Seeking freedom like Dr. King, but faster. The Radical King, the Revolutionary King. Collectively, these 10 chapters are an abbreviated introduction to U.S. and world history, with specific information about organizations and leaders associated with what is commonly referred to as the Civil Rights Movement, with specific information about local, state, national, and world political leaders, as well as specific information about religious and community-based organizations and their leaders in 373 pages. Jones invites us to consider the role of parental influence, the role of religion, the role of family dynamics, the role of education and race on Malcolm X's and Martin Luther King Jr.'s formation and ultimately their worldview on Black dignity and Black citizenship. When I read Praise for the Sword and the Shield on the back jacket cover, I immediately thought of James H. Cones's 1991 publication, Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare. The New York Times Book Review described Cones's contributions as, and I quote, a groundbreaking and highly acclaimed work, close quote, in which the author, and again I quote, cuts through superficial assessments of King and Malcolm as polar opposites to reveal two men whose visions were complementary and moving toward convergence, close quote. Cone used the imagery of dream and nightmare, and I quote, to focus Malcolm and Martin's perspectives on America and to reveal something about the audiences to whom and for whom they spoke, close quote. Writing almost 3 decades before Joseph, Cone presented, and I quote, a careful examination of the life and thought of each man in relation to the other and in the light of the two main resistance traditions in African American history and culture, integrationism and nationalism, close quote. In a social political climate where racism remains a moral dilemma, Joseph, an award-winning author and founding director of the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin, invites readers to consider, and I quote, how King's promotion of nonviolence as shield against Jim Crow's denial of Black citizenship sharpened Malcolm's political sword, placing them in a conversation that would continue beyond death, close quote. Joseph uses these metaphors, sword and shield, and I quote, to argue for a new interpretation of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., close quote. Cone and Joseph both write, cognizant of a need to demystify post-death constructions that often disregard context, culture, and facts of and about these two public figures to promote narratives of convenient expediency, narratives that often place greater emphasis on oratorical tone and style that results in the exacerbation of a myth of respectability politics that presents Malcolm as an instigator of trouble and Martin as a racial apologist for white behavior. Narratives that are steeped in white constructions of racial performance. In The Sword and the Shield, Joseph, and I quote, examines the political lives of two social movement leaders who assume divergent but crucially similar roles about whose lives, activism, and political and intellectual thinking became blueprints for racial and economic justice advocacy around the world, close quote. Two presenting questions informed by the book's subtitle are, one, what is the author's working definition of revolutionary? And two, what might this concept suggest about two preachers' kids whose ministries on the world stage had and continues to have profound societal implications. Instead of articulating a specific meaning to this qualifying description of two lives ended violently at the age of 39, Joseph provides descriptions from which the reader can arrive at an understanding of this term, revolutionary, and how that understanding can in turn inform a textured, contextualized, non-simplistic understanding of Malcolm and Martin. Consider this direct quote Joseph shares from Alex Haley's and Malcolm X's The Autobiography of Malcolm X. I quote, Malcolm was a political renegade, unafraid to identify racial injustice in America as a systemic illness that required nothing less than the radical transformation of the political and racial status quo, close quote. Additional clues about what constitutes a revolutionary life are contained in Joseph's analysis of these two leaders' evolving positions on, and I quote, the pivotal role violence played in maintaining America's racial caste system, a system that defined white violence against Black bodies as legitimate, legal, and morally just, and that regarded Black violence, even in defense of Black humanity, as criminal, dangerous, and a threat to law and order. Close quote. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? About each of these men, Joseph notes, and I quote, Malcolm X, the racial separatist who routinely attacked civil rights demonstrations as wrong-headed, had pivoted into an embrace of politics as the means to produce radical ends. On the other hand, King's conciliatory image masks the beating heart of a political radical who believed in social democracy, privately railed against economic injustice, and viewed nonviolence as a muscular and coercive tactic with world-changing potential, close quote. Of particular importance in grasping the significance of Joseph's characterization of Malcolm and Martin's lives as revolutionary are his insights about radicality, particularly in relation to Black dignity and Black citizenship. Joseph notes that, and I quote, for King, radical Black citizenship, true citizenship, encompass voting, a good job, living wage, decent housing, quality education, healthcare, and nourishment. Malcolm defined Black dignity as a collective goal that required bold leadership and the ability to confront America's tragic racial history. The embrace of Black identity, history, and beauty served as the first step in organizing a revolutionary movement for political self-determination, empowered by Africa's presence on the world stage and the courage of ordinary Black people in insisting that their lives, traditions, culture, and histories mattered in the face of archipelagos of racial terror that stretched from Brooklyn to Birmingham to Bandung, close quote. Who then are these men? One who, and I quote, imagine Blacks participating in a multicultural American dream, close quote, and the other who, and I quote, witness a nightmare of racial segregation, police brutality, and misery that he distilled into a ferocious yet elegant stump speech that made him Harlem's hero and, over time, an icon of the Black Power movement, close quote. Who are these men? When reading The Sword and the Shield, it might be helpful to create an outline or map of defining life events, persons, and movements that influenced Malcolm X, nee Malcolm Little, from his May 19, 1925 birth in Omaha, Nebraska, to the adoption of the name El Hajj Malik El Shabazz shortly before he was murdered on the stage of the Audubon Ballroom in West Harlem on February 21st, 1965. The same exercise is also encouraged to further one's knowledge of Martin Luther King Jr., nee Michael Luther King Jr., from his January 15th, 1929 birth in Atlanta, Georgia, to his April 4th, 1968 assassination on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. By centering a biographical analysis of Malcolm and Martin within the context from which their own self-understanding of personhood and purpose emerged and evolved, Joseph highlights intricacies that require a closer examination of intersectional realities and implicit biases, especially classism, patriarchy, sex, and sexism, operative in the lives of these two leaders. Malcolm's sense of dignity. This notion of Blacks as fully human and thus fully citizens in this republic can be attributed to his parents, who were, and I quote, proud disciples of the legendary Jamaican organizer Marcus Garvey, close quote. Unlike Martin, whose sense of citizenship was influenced by Black elitism and continuity provided by his nuclear family with specific guidance from his father, who pastored a historic Baptist church, Malcolm experienced parental loss and violence at the young age of 6. While Martin would graduate from Morehouse College, Crozer Theological Seminary, and Boston University, earning a Doctor of Philosophy in Systematic Theology at the age of 26, Malcolm dropped out of school at the age of 15, became adept at reading context for survival, and exercised self-initiative to acquire knowledge that would result in him becoming one of the world's major socio-political thinkers. An ordained Baptist clergyman, Joseph is correct to address Martin's infidelity, plagiarism, hierarchical approach to leadership that reveals issues of insecurity cloaked in ageism, sexism, and patriarchy. While most persons may be aware that during his imprisonment, Malcolm was introduced to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, and that upon his reintegration to society, advanced quickly to become one of the most recognized ministers within the Nation of Islam. What may not be of general knowledge is Malcolm's role in sanctioning a culture of violence to which he and his family were subjected following his separation from the Nation of Islam, and to which his assassination is attributed, at least in part. From Joseph, we receive a narrative trajectory of ways in which Malcolm and Martin, shaped by fathers described as a race man and Black nationalists respectively, shifted in time from nemesis to an acknowledgement that though their strategies differed, both, and I quote, sought a moral and political reckoning with America's long history of racial and economic injustice, close quote. As we await the results of this year's national election, the sword and the shield, the revolutionary lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. illustrates that a close examination of these two individuals' political philosophies and factors that influenced a broadening of their worldviews and critique of U.S. policies and race relations should be required reading to further an individual and collective understanding of what is at stake when anyone's full humanity, citizenship, and dignity is jeopardized. Thank you.